This is a U.S.-China media brief produced by the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. The U.S.-China media brief features interviews with experts and other prominent individuals involved in studying and documenting the dynamic and ever-evolving relationship between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. I'm Russell Leong, Director of the U.S.-China Media Brief of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center.
Over a 10-year period. Now, in that survey, you covered such things as job security, insecurity, the relationship of workers and management, the degree of participation they wanted, pay gap between workers and managers, the type of welfare, educational services, and the type of profit sharing that they were interested in. So it's been about 10 years now from the time of the initial data in '98, and right now it's 2009. So what kind of broad trends do you see in your analysis during this 10-year period?
Yeah. For this, if you look at the overall, it's a 10 years period. I think that the macro policy has been went through major changes, because in the 90s, basically, Chinese government, the mainstream of intellectual currents in China was preoccupied with what we now call the so-called Washington consensus kind of things. Basically, people believe in the market forces. People, well, as a reaction to the problem of all the central planning systems, from the top government leader down to the ordinary teacher about intellectuals, and most of the people consider market forces. Once we introduce the market forces, that supply and demand determine how much a person should be paid, and take off workers' job security, and then you can motivate worker or employee to work harder. And then in our study, actually, we already find out by the end of the 1990s, this free market modeling doesn't really work. Of course, you can make workers work longer hours to make them more exhausted, but which doesn't really mean you can generate a high interest identity of workers. And then the resentment of workers was pretty high in terms of their reactions to the market-orientated reform. But ironically enough, since the mainstream ideology was preoccupied with this kind of a market-driven scheme, we didn't read too much about the workers' resentment from the media and newspapers. So the voices of workers disappear. They can hear their voice only in through the informal ways, like you talk to them and in daily life chatting, but not in newspaper, not in media, not in the formal channel. But fortunately enough, the Chinese government eventually realized the problem of this market-driven scheme in terms of economic reform and in terms of the labor relation. For instance, in the year of 1997, if I remember, 1996 and 1997, if I remember correctly, when the Chinese government at the time announced a decision to get rid of all the small and medium-sized the state-owned enterprises. But then the scholar find out that a lot of people is going to lose their job. So the unemployment rate is going to jump. So, and then some scholars, if I remember correctly, the Professor Huang Gang in Tsinghua University, they wrote a report to the central government. Fortunately enough, the central government leadership at the time take Huang Gang's report seriously. So according to my sources, Huang Gang's report on the problem of unemployment was, well, each standing committee members of the leadership of China get a copy of Huang Gang's report in their meeting, emergent meeting. by the end of that meeting, the decision was slow down that process, trying to minimize the impact of that reform. But the good side is they listened to Huang Gang's report, they slowed down that process, which reduced the pressure to a certain degree. But in my point of view, the negative perspective was they're still working on the same directions, right? Still trying to get rid of all those small and medium-sized state-owned enterprises. The ideology is still aimed for the free market reform, with not too much consideration of social constraint and social impacts of the reform. So, but the new government, especially since the year 2003, somehow they recognize the tremendous negative impacts of the free market reform produced. So they start to balance the policy a bit, so put more emphasis on the micro social and economic policy. For instance, trying to make sure workers get their pay on time, and trying to make sure there must be a minimum wage standards. So there are efforts from the new government trying to balance off the negative impact of the pure market-driven reform. So, in my opinion, these days, there's still a lot of problems in terms of the labor relations. But somehow, the macro social economic policy has been tipping back a bit to the left. In that sense, it might be balanced off a little bit on the negative impacts of the free market-driven economic reform.
Now, on the micro level, how are these policies actually enforced? Through managers, or through at what level are they enforced?
I think, in my opinion, and then my observations, the impact is macro in the sense that the central government or the authority will force the lower level of government to pay attention to the rule, law, regulations, and the labor relations. And then in the political structure of China, so once the government wants to do something, they can do it. And then for instance, the Bureau of Labor at the lower level of government, they started to put more pressures in their inspections of the factories. And then the general manager of the factory will have to be more careful. So capitalists, the managers, especially the general managers, their mental, their spirits, their value system won't change, right? So they're business people, they're just trying to get more money, more profit. As Marx pointed out a long time ago, that's still the case. But they just have to be more careful, pay more attention to the rule and regulations. So it's through that mechanisms, workers get their pay more and more on time. So the kind of nasty practice of the labor management might reduce to a certain level.